All right, so welcome again to Introduction to Ethics. I'm Dr. Brzezinski, and I have decided to begin our semester with a consideration of Socrates. Okay. And a couple of you, of course, have taken me before and talked about Socrates, but because of the depth and the richness of Plato, hopefully, you gleaned something from this discussion that you didn't last time. Before we look directly at Plato's Apology, which is where we'll find the portrayal of Socrates as an ethical thinker, I'd like to take just a moment to situate ethics in the wider discipline of philosophy. Now, when we talk about philosophy as a discipline, we are not using the word in the colloquial sense of his or her philosophy of this or that. Philosophy as a science is a 2,000-year-old systematic conversation that takes place either face-to-face or in modern times in professional journals about the fundamental issues that face us as human beings. However, we can do a philosophy of anything. For example, if you were to go to law school, of course you're going to learn the law, you're going to learn how to create a legal defense or prosecution, okay, and become proficient in the decorum of a courtroom. But you're going to be employing some fundamental concepts like the idea of justice, the idea of freedom and punishment, the idea of legality itself, constitutionality. And so a philosopher will take a step backwards from the practice of law itself and ask, what do we mean by these ideas? What is freedom really? What is the justification for punishment? What is the basis for a good law? Okay? Or I could do a philosophy of medicine, in which we'll ask about the fundamental ideas operative in that field, like what it means to care for another human being, what it means to take on the responsibility of prescribing medicines and so forth. But traditionally, philosophy has been broken down into 5 branches or sub-disciplines. Okay? There is metaphysics. And if you took the Introduction to Philosophy course with me, then you are well familiar with this term. What is metaphysics?
The study of ultimate reality.
Thank you, Frankie. Metaphysics is the study of ultimate reality. We all know that there's a difference between appearance and reality. We have all encountered people that put on their best face and appear to be one kind of person and find out later that in fact they may be very different. Okay? If I am walking through the desert, dying of thirst, I may have a hallucination of an oasis of water. It appears that there is water in the distance, but as I approach it, I discover that there really isn't. So we have a common sense understanding of the distinction between appearance and reality. But as philosophers, and particularly metaphysicians, we want to know what the reality of the world consists of. I know how the world appears. I know what my life appears to be. A lot of trouble and responsibility, spattered with moments of joy. But as a metaphysical thinker, I want to know what it really means to be a person. What is the real nature of human existence? What is the real nature of the world? Where did it come from? Was it created? Does God exist? Am I more than just flesh and bone? Is there a soul? Is there an afterlife? These are the traditional sorts of speculative, metaphysical investigations, typical of Western metaphysics. But if I were to say something like, God exists, as a philosopher, it isn't good enough simply to say that I believe God exists because I have simply always been taught that God exists, or I have a feeling that God exists. As philosophers, we have a responsibility to provide reasons, an explanation, a justification for our assertions. And when I ask, how do you know what you believe to know? Then I am asking an epistemological question. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It asks, what constitutes knowledge? What are the conditions that must be satisfied in order to deem a belief knowledge? Even if I have a true belief, that is not yet knowledge. For example, I believe that my car is in the parking lot right now. And I'm probably right about that. But just because my belief is true does not mean that I know it. The only way for me to know it would be to go outside and check. Okay? And even then, you might ask me, how do I know that my senses aren't deceiving me? That I'm just imagining my car is still there? Okay. Now, whenever a philosopher conducts a metaphysical or epistemological investigation and makes some assertion, there is always a structure of the argument. And there is good argument and there is bad argument. And good arguments follow rules. And it may sound strange to the modern ear that there are rules to thinking, because of course, especially in the United States, a nation founded on freedom of thought, religion, speech, petition, assembly, we sort of recoil when people suggest, hey, there are rules to how we ought to think. But whether you realize it or not, you do understand that if I were to say something like A is equal to B, but B is not equal to A, something has gone wrong. That is a contradiction. It violates what we call the principle of identity. Okay? And if I were to focus directly on what constitutes a good argument, the rules of thinking, then we are doing logic. Logic is the philosophical science that studies the forms of valid deductive reasoning. Don't worry about that, okay? I'll let you know when I say something that you ought to really pay attention to. Okay, you should be paying attention, but I give you more than you need, okay? But philosophers don't just ask about things like the origin of the universe, the existence of God, whether the mind and the body are two different things. We are also inclined toward asking about things like beauty and love, art, literature, and the philosophical discipline that investigates the nature of beauty and the relationship between beauty and truth, if one exists, then we are doing aesthetics. Now, of course, Socrates had an interest in all of these things. But according to him, unless I first seek to understand myself, until I turn my philosophical gaze inward and examine my life, my thinking, my behavior, and ask, how ought I to live? What does it mean to live a good life? Then all of this other stuff, to some extent, becomes irrelevant. The most important question we can ask, according to Socrates, is what does it mean to live a good life? Okay. And so Socrates is regarded as the first ethicist, the first philosopher to make the question, how ought I to live, into a topic for philosophical examination. Okay. And perhaps the most famous motto attributed to Socrates is that the unexamined life is not even worth living. That unless we take time to know ourselves, to question the way that we live and think, and to seek what it means to be good, then we have missed out on what is most essentially human. And so Socrates lived his life in pursuit of an understanding of goodness. And for the ancient Greeks, especially Socrates and his student Plato and Aristotle, the student of Plato, goodness meant virtue. Okay? And as we proceed throughout these weeks in the summer, we will see that the history of ethics consists of a number of traditions, each of which begins with some conception of what it means to be good. For Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the good life was a virtuous life. And so, of course, we will have to ask, what is virtue? What does it mean to be virtuous? What are the virtues? Others have suggested that the good life is the happy life. Still others have said that the good life is one in which your self-interest is satisfied. Still others have suggested that the good life means caring. And perhaps one of the most prevalent ways of thinking about the good life is from a religious perspective. That the good life is one consistent with the will of God. But notice, I can't be justified in saying that the good life is the life consistent with the will of God unless I can also provide justification for the claim that God exists. Perhaps we do, perhaps we don't. And that is a major philosophical concern. And we'll talk about it. To some extent. Okay. But I want to begin this semester with a consideration of Plato's Apology, because, of course, Socrates himself, Plato's teacher, never wrote anything down philosophically. He would teach by asking questions. Philosophy is most authentically a spoken discipline. And so Socrates would ask us a very seemingly simple question, like, what is justice? What is courage? And his interlocutor, which is the word we use for one's partner in conversation, okay? Interlocutor, would give a response. Justice is this or that. And Socrates would examine that response. And if he discovered a contradiction, or that the response was incomplete, then his interlocutor would have to modify his or her response. And the questioning and answering would go back and forth like this, in the hopes that the more carefully we think about ideas like justice or courage or temperance, the closer we can get to a proper understanding of the real nature of these ideas. And this concern with what it really means to live a good life is the study of ethics. And that's why we are here this summer. Okay? Ethics is the philosophical investigation of what it means to be good, the meaning of goodness. And we will consider 5 or 6 major traditions in Western philosophy, each of which has its own conception of the meaning of goodness, from which a set of principles arises. For example, the Golden Rule is an ethical principle. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And from that ethical principle arises perhaps a set of rules, like don't take that which belongs to another. Why? Because you wouldn't want someone else to take that which belongs to you. So we'll be talking about ethical principles, and at the same time that we learn the major ideas developed over the history of ethics, we will do so with a critical eye. Okay? We want to examine these ideas because the most important thing from my perspective is not that you learn the history of ethics so that you can sit at the Thanksgiving dinner table with your family and say, hey, did you know that Kant said we ought to treat all rational beings as ends in themselves and never only as a means? Okay? No. The point is the quality of your life. That's always what philosophy should be about. As long as philosophy remains strictly an intellectual exercise, then it's just a game. What is at stake in doing ethics is your life and becoming open to the possibility of new ways of thinking and living to improve the quality of your life, to make you more free, to make you more available to possibilities which for the most part remain covered up, because in our everyday activity we typically don't have time for this sort of thinking. We're busy. They have jobs, families, obligations. But at some point in everyone's life, the why arises. And we have to ask ourselves, why am I living this particular life? And ultimately, if we're honest with ourselves, at some point we each ask, why do I live at all? Especially in the midst of crisis. Okay? And toward the end of the semester, we'll consider some thinkers, existentialist thinkers, who suggest that there is no fixed, good way to live. That the meaning of human existence is something we choose, that we ourselves create. Okay, but that is further down the line. So let's begin now by looking at Plato's Apology. And the very first thing to keep in mind is that apology here does not mean contrition. It doesn't mean saying I'm sorry for having done something. The word apology here is a translation of the Greek apologia, which means a justification of something, an explanation. And so what Socrates is really doing here, beyond defending himself against these criminal charges, is justifying philosophy itself and urging us to think critically about the way we live and always to seek virtue. All right. So remember this. At the time of this proceeding, Socrates is 70, much older than the audience, which is his jury, because in ancient Athens, a true democracy, every citizen voted on everything. So he is addressing 550-some people. Okay? And he is facing two separate sets of accusations. Okay? There is the modern charge brought against him by Lycon, Miletus, and Anytus, who are the prosecutors present in the courtroom. And they are charging him with two specific offenses, which were what?
I think I read that he was like, they thought he was brainwashing the youth.
Corrupting the youth, and I think brainwashing is a very good way of interpreting that corruption. Okay, so corrupting the youth. And
Not conforming to the religion.
yes, not believing in the gods of the state. The official sanctioned gods, because we know that the ancient Greeks were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. Yes?
This is Plato's account of what happened to Socrates, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Let me say a word about that. Plato at this time is a young man, around 20 years old or so. And Socrates is his mentor. And while Socrates himself did not write his philosophy, as Plato matured, he began his own philosophical career by recounting the conversations that Socrates had about ideas like courage and piety and temperance and beauty and love and so forth. As Plato matured philosophically, he developed his own metaphysical theory. And so sometimes we make a distinction between the Socratic dialogues and the Platonic dialogues. And as you say, we call them dialogues because they are always an account of a conversation. Okay? Sometimes it is Socrates himself telling us about a conversation he had. At other times, there is an anonymous narrator recounting the conversation. And still at other times, we are witness to the conversation itself. Okay? But Plato, interestingly, always keeps himself out of it. Okay? He removes himself from the main action. And that is itself revealing about Plato's way of thinking about things. And we'll talk about that when we get to the section on Plato. Now, these two charges are those brought against him by the politicians, the poets, and the craftsmen. Okay? But there is another set of accusations brought against him. Those raised by the people he calls the ancients, who have long since passed on. So they are not present in the courtroom for Socrates to cross-examine. So Socrates says, it's almost like I am fighting with shadows. And it's these ancient accusers that I'm really worried about. They are far more dangerous than the modern guys. Now, why do you suppose that is?
Because they know what it's, they either know or don't know what it's like to not be on Earth anymore, I guess. Like they're not alive anymore.
That's an interesting suggestion. But of course, their accusations were made while they were still alive. Okay?
Their accusations are ingrained in the minds of the youth.
Excellent. That's right. These ancient figures would promulgate the rumor that Socrates was an evildoer, that he was a charlatan, that he would speculate about things that dwelt deep within the earth and would make the true appear to be false and the false appear to be true. And because these ancients got a hold of the people in the audience when they were very young, the idea that Socrates was to be avoided, an evildoer, as you say, was deeply ingrained and a part of their basic thinking. And when we learn something as children and believe it throughout our lives, it becomes part of us and very difficult to relinquish. Okay? It's like riding a bike or something, you know? I mean, once you know how to ride a bike, you never forget. So, what Socrates is really fighting against here is something much more formidable than these silly charges, which he does away with great proficiency. He's actually fighting against the psychological tendency of human beings to cling to unexamined ideas, to our comfort zone, to the familiar, to the way that we have always thought about things. Because to expose your most basic self-conception or worldly ideas to examination is risky. Because it is these ideas that carry us through, that get us out of bed in the morning. Human beings need something to hold on to, something to live for. And the threat, or even the notion that my most firmly held beliefs are possibly false, or perhaps even the idea that there are different ways of thinking about things other than my own, is threatening. And that's what Socrates is fighting against. Okay?
Good question. So you're saying that the ancients, so the people that Socrates is having trouble convincing are the people that are old at this time, right?
Those people are gone. The audience right now, the Athenian assembly, as they call it, basically everyone who lives in Athens, at this time is a younger population, okay, younger than Socrates. But what he has to overcome are the ideas that were implanted in their minds as children.
Right.
Okay?
Okay.
And that's why, despite the fact that Socrates shows these charges to be spurious, false, and impressively sways a great number of people to his side, such that the final vote came down to a difference of 50 or so votes in favor of his guilt. The fact that he is ultimately found guilty and put to death sort of makes him into a martyr for truth. Okay? All right. So we have to now turn to the dialogue itself. And there are a few things here that I really want to focus on. First of all, and some of you have heard me discuss this before, the very first thing Socrates does is to identify with his audience. He says, "How you have felt, O men of Athens, at hearing the speeches of my accusers I cannot tell. But I, for one, found their speeches to be so compelling that I almost forgot who I was. They almost convinced me that I was guilty." Okay? Now, on the surface of things, of course, he's warning us against the power of rhetoric, of pretty speeches, to be convincing. And you've all experienced this. You know, if you've ever watched court TV or something, and you hear the prosecution speak, you're like, man, this guy is guilty. But then you hear the defense, and you're like, oh, now I'm not so sure. Okay? The philosopher is always at odds with those we call sophists, people who are experts in persuasive speech and teach that art to the children of the politicians so that they may grow up to be persuasive speakers as well. Okay? to gain power over people. But of course, Socrates is being facetious here. He doesn't, for a moment, actually believe that he's guilty. So I want to ask you, what do you suppose it could mean at a deeper level to say, I forgot who I was? When do we forget ourselves? What can that mean, metaphorically speaking? If I'm short with you, or I say something unkind to you, and then I apologize later and say, man, I'm sorry, I was in a bad mood, I just forgot myself. That wasn't me. We mean that we acted in a way that is not consistent with who we really are. That we have a tendency to become sort of alienated from our true self. Okay? And because Socrates begins his entire defense by raising this issue of self-forgetting, I think Plato is alerting us to the real issue. What Socrates is doing here is not just attempting to justify his actions, his public interrogation of people who claimed to have knowledge that got him into so much trouble. He is defending the philosophical lifestyle itself. He is attempting to show us that the unexamined life is not worth living. And that when we devote ourselves to the pursuit of money and power and prestige, reputation, it is we who are guilty of believing in false gods. That is a form of idolatry. Because, according to Socrates, no matter how much money or power or prestige you have, it can never buy you virtue. But if you learn what it means to be virtuous first, then everything else that is good for a person will follow as a natural result. And indeed, you will probably come to realize that those things which the world idolizes and teaches us mark a successful life, like wealth and power, were never the real thing to begin with. Okay? And I do not think Socrates is saying that he has the answer. The importance is in the questioning, learning the intellectual humility to raise a question is perhaps the hardest thing for us to do, because we don't like to admit that we're wrong, or even the possibility that I have spent the last decade or 2 decades devoting my time and energy to something that was empty and unworthy of me. So, please keep in mind this business of self-forgetting, and that perhaps this is really the illness that Socrates is diagnosing. Indeed, he referred to himself often as a physician of the soul or the mind, rather than of the body, just as the body can suffer illness, which is treated by a physician. The mind or the soul, the self, also is prone to illness. And the illness of the mind is closing ourselves off to new possibilities of thinking and living. When we forget what we most fundamentally are, which perhaps is freedom, beings that can choose their own path and are responsible for what becomes of them, then we have forgotten ourselves, and the symptoms of that self-forgetting is devoting ourselves to false goods. And that's why it's ironic that he's being charged with believing in false gods, because that's precisely why he has spent his life urging his fellow citizens to examine their lives. Okay. So Socrates says, look, I know what you're thinking. Socrates, if you're innocent, if you haven't done anything wrong, then why are we here? Why are these people so incensed by you? Why have you evoked such hatred? And in response, Socrates tells the story of when his buddy Chaerephon went to visit the oracle at Delphi. Okay? Does anybody remember this story? What does Chaerephon do? What does he ask this oracle? And what is an oracle?
Somebody who sees a future coming.
Yeah. An oracle is a seer, a prophet. Okay? Like the oracle in the Matrix series, right? And during the life of Socrates, these oracles were women that would kind of set up shop in caves, and people would consult them about their futures, about their fortunes, and they would go into a sort of trance and presumably would be a voice piece for the gods. So Chaerephon goes to the oracle in the town of Delphi and asks, is there anybody wiser than Socrates? And what does the oracle say? No. There is none wiser than Socrates. Now notice, that's not the same thing as saying Socrates is the wisest. She is simply saying that there is none wiser. Now, Chaerephon is all excited about this because, he loves Socrates. And so he runs back and he tells him. And Socrates is totally perplexed. He says, how can this be? Because I don't know anything. And what he means by that is that unlike ordinary folk who learn a trade, his contemporaries were either, poets or, seamstresses or cobblers or had some kind of technical knowledge, a trade. Socrates fought in the Athenian army and afterwards received this calling to help his fellows wake up, to examine themselves. So Socrates is worried here because the oracle is supposed to be the spokesperson for a god. And so there are only two possibilities: that this is a false prophet, or Socrates himself has failed to know himself. In what sense can I be wise? I don't know how to write poetry. I don't know how to build ships. I don't know how to run a country. So what does he do? He goes to visit these groups of people who have a reputation for wisdom. He visits the poets, the craftsmen, and the politicians. And what he discovers in each case is that while they did indeed possess a specialized kind of knowledge, what in Greek is called a techne, okay? A technical skill. From which we get our word technology or technical, okay? Because they became so good in their respective arts, they became prideful and got seduced by this idea that, well, since I'm great at this one thing, I must be great at everything. And they believed they knew all sorts of high matters. They thought themselves to be authorities on everything, not just their poetry or their craft. And so it's at that point that Socrates makes his discovery. He says, now I get it. Okay? I don't possess your technical knowledge. But neither one of us knows anything about the will of God, or if the gods even exist, or what is ultimately real, or where the universe came from, or what it really means to be virtuous. The difference between you and me, however, is that I know that I don't know these things, but you think that you do. And in that, I am indeed wiser. So wisdom, for Socrates, does not mean specialized knowledge. It means knowing and having the courage to admit what you don't know. That you don't know everything. Because until I can admit that I don't know, I can't even raise a question. So wisdom, in the Socratic sense, means the admission of one's own ignorance. And this is the beginning of spiritual, intellectual evolution, growth. And so Socrates takes this event as a sign that it is the will of God for him to use his analytical skill to help others realize the shortcomings in their thinking. So when, for example, a politician would come to town to campaign and give a speech, Socrates would publicly question him about his platform and show that he didn't know what he was talking about. Okay? And so obviously he made enemies with powerful people. And that's what's going on here. That's why he's brought on trial. Okay. Now I do want to say a word about the modern charges, okay, and how Socrates defeats them. And it's so quick, I think Plato is alerting us that there's something much deeper going on here than just a trial. When it comes to defending himself against the charge of corrupting the youth, he simply asks his accuser, I believe it was Anytus at this moment, whether or not anybody would intentionally hurt themselves. Now, while of course we all do things that we know are harmful, okay, we may take some kind of relief or even pleasure in inflicting pain on ourselves. But even when I'm doing that, it's what I feel at that moment that I need. It's making me feel better, at least for the moment, or distracting me from my pain. So Anytus agrees. He says nobody would ultimately seek their own ruin. Okay? And then Socrates says, well, okay, fine. But you realize that the youth you say I corrupt are my friends. I live with them every day. And you know that the people you spend your time with rub off on you. Okay? You become like the company you keep. And so you are telling me that I intentionally corrupt the people with whom I live, and so indirectly I am intentionally corrupting myself. But you just admitted that no one would ever do that. So either, if I do corrupt them, I don't do it intentionally, and therefore it isn't a crime, or I simply don't corrupt them. Then he turns to the charge of not believing in the gods of the state, and this one's even sillier, because he asks Anytus or Miletus, I can't remember which, are you saying that I don't believe, like everyone else, that the sun and the moon are gods? Okay, you know, they believed in a plethora of gods. Or just that I believe in different gods? Or are you saying that I don't believe in any gods? That I'm a complete atheist? And of course, the prosecution, in its attempt to make Socrates out in the worst possible light, says, Socrates, you don't believe in anything. You're a complete atheist. And then Socrates has it. Because he says, well, a moment ago you said that I believe in different gods. So how can I be an atheist that believes in gods? Okay. So again, the prosecution is caught in a contradiction. So Socrates dismisses these charges. Nonetheless, The jury is dismissed, they deliberate, and come back with a guilty verdict. Even though the margin is only something like 50 votes. Okay? Out of 570 people or so. So, at this point, Socrates has an opportunity to address the jury and to suggest his own punishment, which was their custom. So, sort of mockingly, Socrates says, well, let me think about this a second. What do I deserve for spending my entire life attempting to help you to live well? I think you should give me free room and board for the rest of my life in the Prytaneum, which was like the YMCA or something. Okay. But of course, as we know, he ends up being sentenced to death by drinking hemlock poison, okay, which is its own remarkable story. But then he says, look, even if you were to say to me, Socrates, this time we won't mind the prosecution and we'll let you off under one condition, that you promise to desist from the public practice of philosophy. Socrates says, I can't do that. When I was in the army and our generals commanded me to stay at my post, despite the threat of death, I stayed at my post. Now, wouldn't it be strange if when I believe in my heart of hearts that God has commanded me to help others, to awaken, to question, to seek virtue, if I were to abandon that post out of the fear of death, then you might rightly charge me with atheism. But I will never give up the practice of philosophy, not even if I have to die many times. Kill me again and again. Now again, on the surface, this sounds just like exaggeration, hyperbole, okay? But what could it mean at a deeper level to say that one can die many times? Yes, a kind of spiritual, intellectual, psychological death. When you have lived your life for years believing something that you later find out to be false, you're at a crossroads, at which point you either have to make the conscious decision to lie to yourself, to remain comfortable, or you've got to let go. You've got to let the person you were die so that you can emerge into something more. Like the butterfly emerges from the caterpillar. And this theme, of course, is iterated in the New Testament over and over. Largely because St. Augustine was a Platonist. Okay, so he interpreted the teachings of Jesus along Platonic lines. Like the idea that in order to find yourself, you must first lose yourself. He who finds his life shall lose it, but he who gives up his life for my sake shall find it. Right? That we must go through a sort of death experience in order to enter into salvation. Yes. And so, of course, Socrates here is talking about living a good life and seeking virtue, because he was never arrogant enough to say, I know that the gods exist, and just these gods, and what their will was. In fact, later Plato is very clear about saying, I don't know if God exists. I don't know what is ultimately real. But if I don't at least inquire, if I don't seek, then I certainly have lost everything. But if God doesn't exist, what have I lost by believing anyway? So he tells us that virtue never comes from wealth. No amount of money, power, or prestige can purchase virtue. But if you first seek virtue, then all other things will follow. And again, you hear the New Testament, right? Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven, and all things else shall follow. Okay? And this is typical. You'll see that great ideas are always very simple, and they run through the history of philosophy. Okay? All right. Now, all we've really done here is to get a portrayal of who Socrates was and what he stood for, and to set the tone for the rest of the semester. But now, we need to ask, what did he mean by virtue? What is virtue? And what does it mean to say that the good life is the virtuous life? And for that, we're going to turn to the work of Aristotle, which is discussed in chapter 2 of the textbook. Okay, again, our textbook is Ethics, the Basics by John Mazzoni. If it takes you a couple days to get it, that's fine. You'll be okay. All right? But we do have our first quiz, which you take online in the assessments folder on Blackboard. And you'll receive an email announcement when it becomes available, and then you'll have 24 hours to take it. Okay? But that won't happen until Monday. Okay? Your reading assignment is on the calendar. All right? Cool. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.